My brother looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're just here because you have nowhere else to go. You always were the slow one." He said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing for years. Casual, almost bored, like he'd finally found the right moment to let it land. Behind him, my father nodded slowly from the recliner. My sister-in-law stood near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching me with that particular expression people wear when they want to witness a collapse without officially participating in one. I was holding a bag of groceries. Tim Hortons coffee for my father, the kind he liked, double-double, the prescription refills for his blood pressure medication that I'd picked up on my lunch break, a bag of clementines because his doctor said he needed more vitamin C. My brother hadn't asked how my father was doing in 3 months. Not once. "I'm just saying," my brother continued, "now that Renata and I are moving in, it makes more sense for you to find your own place. Give us some space." He paused. "You're 34 years old, Chris. It's embarrassing, honestly." Chris, not even my full name. Like he couldn't spare the extra syllable. I set the groceries down on the front hall table. Slowly, carefully. The kind of careful that means you're choosing silence over something you'd regret. Here's what my brother didn't know. The house he was standing in, the one he'd just announced he was moving into, the one where he planned to raise his family and reclaim some version of a birthright he'd done absolutely nothing to earn, had been minutes away from disappearing 8 months earlier. And I was the only reason it hadn't. I didn't say any of that. I picked up the Tim Hortons bag and walked it to the kitchen, set it beside my father's chair, and told him I'd be back Thursday to drive him to his appointment. My father looked at the bag, then at me, then at my brother, and said nothing. That silence was its own kind of verdict. That night, I sat in my car in the driveway of the house I'd grown up in for about 20 minutes before I felt calm enough to drive. The street was quiet the way Canadian suburbs get quiet in February. That specific hush when snow absorbs sound and the cold makes everything feel slightly unreal. Streetlights turned the snow orange. Somewhere down the block, a snowblower was running. I thought about the folder in my desk drawer back at my apartment, the one with everything in it. And I thought about my brother's face when he said the word embarrassing, the small, satisfied flicker in his eyes right after. And I understood for the first time that this had been building for years. He just needed an excuse to make it official. So I gave him time to get comfortable. That was my first decision. I should explain who I am, or at least who I am to this family. Because the surface version won't make sense without the underneath. I'm the younger son. 34. I work in financial compliance for a mid-sized logistics company based in Mississauga. It's not glamorous work. I review contracts, flag regulatory exposure, make sure the company doesn't accidentally step into something that creates liability. It's the kind of job that nobody fully understands at dinner parties but that pays well and, more importantly, teaches you to read documents like other people read novels. Every word matters. What's missing matters more. My brother Wesley is 6 years older. He works in sales, commercial real estate, the kind of job that sounds impressive in the abstract, but has always been for him a series of almost closes and repetitions. He's charming in a way that works in rooms full of people who don't know him well. He married Renata 4 years ago. She's fine. She's not the villain in this. She just went along with things because it was easier than questioning them. Our mother died when I was 26. Pancreatic cancer. Quick and devastating in the way that disease always is. After that, my father went quiet in a way that never fully reversed. He kept the house in Oakville, the one they'd owned for 20 years. But the maintenance started slipping. The lawn, the furnace, the leaking corner of the basement that he kept meaning to fix. I started coming by more. First on weekends, then during the week. I noticed the property tax bill sitting unopened on the counter in November 2 years ago. I opened it. I paid it. I didn't say anything, because making my father feel like a burden seemed worse than the $800. Then the property tax bill in the spring. Then his car insurance renewal that he'd missed. Then the water heater. Then, 8 months ago, the letter that changed everything. It was from the mortgage servicer. I only saw it because I was helping my father sort through a pile of mail he'd been ignoring for 6 weeks. It was a notice of intent to commence power of sale proceedings. His mortgage had been in arrears for 4 months. In Ontario, the process can move quickly once it starts. The house could be gone inside of a year if nothing changed. My father hadn't told anyone. He was embarrassed, I think, or maybe he'd convinced himself it would resolve on its own, the way people sometimes convince themselves about financial problems when they don't have the language or the energy to address them directly. My brother didn't know. My brother had never once asked about the finances. I sat with my father that evening and we went through everything. His pension was covering basics. His savings had been slowly spent down over 3 years on small things and medium things, and the general invisible cost of getting older alone. The arrears were significant but not impossible. Not for me. I paid them. Then I set up automatic transfers to cover the monthly mortgage going forward until I could sort out something more sustainable. I did it quietly, through my own account, because I knew if I made it a production, my father would refuse, and we'd spend 6 months arguing while the house got closer to sale. I also knew, with a clarity I didn't examine too closely at the time, that my brother would find a way to turn my involvement into something that diminished it. He always did. What I didn't tell my father, to cover the arrears and the ongoing payments, I deferred my own RRSP contributions for the year and moved money from a savings account I'd been building toward a down payment. That was mine, a thing I'd built slowly over 6 years of careful choices. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because the alternative was watching my father lose the house he'd lived in for 20 years, and I couldn't do that. What I also didn't tell anyone, because I was now the consistent payer of record on the mortgage and had been handling the associated correspondence with the servicer, I had documentation, a lot of it. And I'd also, about 3 months after the arrears were resolved, had a quiet conversation with a real estate lawyer about what all of that documentation actually meant. That conversation was useful. I'm getting ahead of myself. After my brother's announcement, I gave it 2 weeks before I did anything. I wanted to observe. Wesley and Renata moved in gradually, the way people do when they're testing whether anyone will object. First a few boxes, then a truck. Then the day I came by to take my father to his cardiology follow-up and found that my brother had rearranged the living room furniture without asking and put a lock on the door to the second bedroom that my father had been using as a study. My father mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, now, briefly, looking at a spot near the window rather than at me. Wesley thinks we need better use of the space. He paused. Renata wants that room for eventually. You know, I drove him to the appointment. I waited in the waiting room with a coffee and my phone. I thought about what eventually meant when you were 71 and living in a house you almost lost and your son was quietly measuring square footage. That evening I called my father's family lawyer. Not to do anything yet, just to understand where things stood legally and to make sure the documentation I had was as solid as I believed it to be. It was. Over the following month, I started noticing the pattern of small decisions that were stacking up around my father without his full awareness. Wesley had added himself to the joint cheeking account my father and I shared for household expenses, the one I'd set up and funded specifically for the property upkeep. He hadn't asked me. He'd apparently told my father it would be easier for everyone. He started using the account for things that had nothing to do with the house. I said nothing. I opened a separate account. I moved what I needed to move. I documented everything, dates, amounts, descriptions. The way I document things at work, without emotion, just precision. Accountants and compliance people are dangerous enemies because they never lose paperwork. Then came the dinner. My father had asked me to come for Sunday dinner, which I did most weeks. Renata had cooked, which was fine. She's a better cook than I am. We sat around the table, and for the first 20 minutes it was almost normal. Then Wesley set down his fork and looked at me with that particular elder brother expression, the one that's meant to convey disappointed patience. Renata and I have been thinking, he said, that it might be time for Dad to consider whether this house still makes sense for him. He glanced at my father. It's a lot to maintain. He's not getting younger, and honestly, if we sold now, the market's still reasonable. We could set him up somewhere smaller, more manageable, maybe one of those retirement communities in Burlington. My father looked at his plate. Renata said, "We've been doing some research. There are really nice options." I looked at my brother. I thought about 8 months of mortgage payments. I thought about the notice of intent letter. I thought about my deferred RRSP. I thought about my nephew, my brother's stepson from Renata's first relationship, a 12-year-old kid named Sam who'd left me a voicemail 2 weeks earlier because the internet had been disconnected and he couldn't do his homework, and my brother hadn't been home and he didn't know who else to call. That voicemail, I'd listened to it 3 times. The particular quality of embarrassment in a kid's voice when he has to ask for help with something that should have been handled already. Sam didn't get to choose any of this. He was just along for it. I looked at Wesley for a long moment. Then I said I thought it was an interesting idea and that maybe we should all think about it carefully. I asked my father how he felt. My father said he wasn't sure. My brother said the decision was really about what was practical. Renata refreshed everyone's water. I drove home in the dark and sat in my parking garage for a while thinking. I called my lawyer from the car. "You ready to move forward?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "but soon. I need to explain something about the house, because this is the part that matters legally, and it's the part that's complicated to understand without context. When my father nearly lost the property to power of sale, the mortgage servicer had already begun formal proceedings. Before I stepped in with the arrears payment, there was a brief window where my father, in something of a panic, had signed a document prepared by a financial consultant he'd found through a community notice board. The document was framed as a private lending agreement, a short-term loan from an investment holding company, to cover the immediate arrears and stabilize the mortgage. What the document also contained, embedded in Schedule C in language my father hadn't fully read, was a partial interest assignment in the property as collateral. The investment holding company was mine. I'd incorporated it 2 years earlier for other purposes, but it existed, it was legitimate, and when the lawyer reviewed the signed agreement, the interest assignment was valid. My father had signed it in front of a notary. I want to be clear that I hadn't set this up as a trap. I'd structured it the way I did because I was trying to protect the asset while also protecting my father's dignity. If I'd simply said I'm giving you money, he would have refused. The formal structure let him accept it as a loan, something he could theoretically repay, which made him feel less like a charity case. I'd never intended to enforce the interest clause. It was protection, not a weapon, until my brother started making plans to sell my father's house to put him in a retirement community in Burlington. The formal notice arrived on a Wednesday. I didn't send it myself. My lawyer did. It went to my father's address, addressed to Wesley, because by that point Wesley had legally established himself as a co-resident and had been acting functionally as if he had decision-making authority over the property. The notice outlined the outstanding private lending obligation connected to the property, the interest assignment detailed in Schedule C, and my right as the lender to seek formal recognition of my interest in any sale or transfer proceedings. It also noted the arrears of repayment on the private loan itself, which had never been repaid because my father hadn't known there was anything to repay. He thought I'd handled it as a favor. I had, but the paper said otherwise. My brother called 11 times that night. I let them go to voicemail. My father called me. That conversation was the hardest part of all of this. "Chris," my father said. His voice was very quiet. "Did you put a claim on the house?" "Dad," I said, "I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to come over tomorrow morning and I'm going to bring my lawyer and I'm going to explain everything. All of it. From the beginning, I need you to hear it from me directly." He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "Okay, I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold and looked out the window at the dark street below. Snow was falling again. February in Ontario has a specific quality of endurance to it. You just keep going through it, one grey week after another, and eventually it ends. The next morning, I drove to Oakville. We sat at the kitchen table, my father, my lawyer, and me. Wesley arrived 20 minutes late, which I think was strategic, an attempt to seem composed. Renata stayed in the living room. I could hear the television on low. I walked my father through everything, the notice of intent from 18 months ago, the arrears, the payments, the private lending structure, the interest clause, every transfer, every receipt, every document. I had a binder. I'd organized it by date. I slid a copy across to my father and kept one for myself and gave a third to Wesley's side of the table, though Wesley didn't pick it up immediately. My father listened without interrupting. He's always been that kind of person. He'll take in something enormous and just sit with it, turn it over, look at all the sides before he responds. I've always respected that about him, even when it meant I had to wait a long time to find out what he was thinking. When I finished, he looked down at the binder. He looked at the transfer records. He looked at the dates. "You did all of this," he said slowly, "and you never said anything. I didn't want you to feel like a burden," I said. "I know that sounds like a line, but that's actually why." He nodded once. He didn't look at Wesley. Wesley said, "This is a legal maneuver. He's using a technicality to block us from making reasonable decisions about the property." My lawyer said calmly, "Your brother holds a documented interest in this property through a valid private lending agreement your father signed and had notarized. That's not a technicality, that's a legal position." Wesley looked at me. "You did this on purpose." I thought about that night in the driveway, the cold, the orange streetlights, my brother's face when he said embarrassing. "What I did on purpose," I said, "was keep Dad in this house." The room was quiet for a while. The television in the living room went to commercial. What followed was 2 months of negotiation that I won't detail entirely, because most of it was legal correspondence and mediated discussions that would bore most people into the ground. The short version: we reached a structured agreement. My father kept the house. Wesley and Renata's plan to move him to Burlington went nowhere. I formalized a repayment plan between the holding company and my father that was, in practical terms, designed to be manageable over 10 years, and would ultimately result in the interest assignment being discharged. The private lending arrangement became, for the first time, an actual transparent loan that my father understood fully. Wesley moved out 6 weeks after the notice arrived. He and Renata found a rental in Hamilton. The arrangement had apparently not been as attractive once it became clear the house came with legal complications he hadn't anticipated. I helped my father find a part-time property management service that could handle the maintenance tasks he'd been quietly struggling with. I set up his finances with a fee-only financial planner, someone independent, someone who would look out for him without any conflicting interest. I paid for the first year of her fees. The relatives had opinions, they always do. An uncle on my mother's side called me calculating. An aunt said I'd humiliated Wesley unnecessarily. Several people who had never once driven my father to a medical appointment suddenly had thoughts about family loyalty. I listened. I thanked them for sharing. I did not explain myself to anyone who hadn't earned the context. My brother and I didn't speak for 4 months. When we finally did, it was at my father's birthday dinner in June, the kind of warm Ontario evening where you can sit on the back porch and the light goes golden around 7, and everything looks temporary and lovely. Wesley sat across from me. He was quieter than usual, less performing. At some point after dinner, we ended up standing near the garage together. Not quite a conversation, just proximity. He said, without looking at me, "I didn't know about the mortgage. Dad didn't tell me." "I know," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me." I thought about that. I thought about all the years he'd been the one who got called for the big announcements and shown up for the celebratory dinners, and then drifted back out of contact whenever things got complicated or expensive, or just ordinary. I thought about Sam, calling me from a house without internet because nobody'd paid the bill. "Maybe," I said. "But I didn't think you'd want to know." He didn't argue with that. I think that was the most honest thing either of us had said to each other in years. My father and I have dinner most Sundays now. He's learned to leave his mail in a basket by the door, and we go through it together every 2 weeks, the way some families watch sports or play cards. Our version of regular maintenance. He made a joke about it last month that surprised me. He said, "I feel like I finally got an accountant and a son in one person." Then he looked slightly embarrassed, the way he does when he says something warmer than he meant to. I told him he'd always had both. He just hadn't needed the accountant part until recently. Sam still calls sometimes. He's 13 now. He got into a hockey skills program in the spring and wanted to tell someone, and apparently decided that someone was me. We talked for 40 minutes about skating technique, a subject I know approximately nothing about, but I listened carefully and asked what I hoped were intelligent questions, and he didn't seem to notice the gap in my expertise. Last month he called to say he'd made the rep team. I thought, standing in my kitchen with a phone pressed to my ear, and the late afternoon sun coming through the window at a long, low angle, that this was the part nobody tells you about when they talk about revenge. Not the legal notices, not the documentation, not even the moment when someone finally understands the position they're in. It's the quiet stuff that comes after. The Sunday dinners, the hockey updates, the inheritance that doesn't get sold out from under a person who lived in it for 20 years. My brother had assumed that usefulness was the same thing as desperation. That a person who shows up reliably and doesn't demand acknowledgement is a person who has no other options. He mistook my patience for passivity and my silence for acceptance. What it actually was a long and careful accumulation of the kind of evidence that holds up in documentation. I bought a condo last year near the lakeshore in Burlington, not far from the retirement community where Wesley had once planned to install our father. It's small, but it's mine, and the mortgage is manageable, and I'm funding my RRSP again at full contributions. The balcony faces west. On clear evenings in summer, you can see the lake turn a particular shade of copper just before the light disappears, and the whole city gets quiet for about 30 seconds, in a way that makes you feel, briefly, like everything is in its right place. I didn't do any of this to hurt my brother. I want to be clear about that. I did it because my father deserved to stay in his home, and because someone had to keep the structure standing while everyone else walked through it like it would always just be there. The dangerous thing about reliable people, the thing nobody tells you, is that we're only invisible until we decide to stop being. And when we stop, we tend to have better paperwork than anyone expected.